Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth Politics and IR Congress. My name is Özgür Tüfekçi, and I'm the head of the Department of International Relations at Karadeniz Technical University and the convener of the Congress. Even though I'm disappointed that we cannot be together at PolIR 2021 in Trabzon, Turkey, I'm glad to have the opportunity to connect digitally. The faculty in our department has worked hard to make sure that the PolIR 2021 experience is excellence for all. That's why I would like to thank each of them, each of the member of the department sincerely. Without any further delay, let's get started. I would like to welcome one of the leading scholars in the field of IR, Peace and Conflict Studies, Professor Oliver Richmond. Professor Richmond will kick us off today with his talk titled Rethinking the International Peace, Architecture and Counter-Peace Dynamics. Professor Richmond, welcome again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. How long would you like me to speak for?
It might be 30 minutes yeah. Or 35 minutes. It's up to you.
Sure. Mm-hmm. All right, I'll aim for about that. And everyone can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, yes. Good. All right, let me just, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to think about some work that I've been doing over the last few years on extending the earlier work that I've done on critiquing liberal peace theory and critiquing state building and proposing that we find new ways of foregrounding local political agency in peacemaking. That was in my post-liberalism work and hybridity work, which brought forward the idea that there were these everyday long-standing processes which we could look at connecting with the broader international peace architecture and the systems and theories that had developed. And in doing that work, over a long period of time, I sort of come to the conclusion that a lot of the design for peacekeeping, peacemaking, state building, peace building, conflict resolution, and conflict transformation had taken place obviously in the Northern Academy and in Northern or multilateral policy settings, like the UN in New York or in Geneva or Brussels or in Washington and London and so on, which had been drawing on their historical experience of foreign policy and colonialism, peacekeeping, and so on. But they were really designed with the interests of home populations at the forefront, rather than with the ethic of the everyday, the political ethic of the everyday, that is, conflict-affected societies themselves. And what we saw in a lot of that work was an attempt to balance the interests, the foreign policy and domestic interests of northern states, most often, with post-colonial, post-socialist and post-war populations in the East, in the global South, in South America and Central America, and so forth. And to cut a very long story short, there were good intentions, very mixed results. And over time, as the international peace architecture itself broadened, widened, deepened, got more complex, and our knowledge grew about it, the more it became, let's say, ineffective, and the more the interests of security interests and economic interests of northern states were foregrounded in peacekeeping, peace building, and state building. And of course, all of this came together in the connection between the war on terror, state building, stabilization theories, and policy practices. Now, I come from a critical perspective in the UK academy, and I've always been very interested in critical theories and methodologies, drawing as they have done on Marx and so many other thinkers who worked really to foreground subaltern, everyday rights needs and what we would now call questions of equity, fairness, justice, sustainability, and more broadly, global justice. So if you equate peace with global justice in the scientific context of today, and then you read backwards through the history of peace theory and peace policy, you can see that there have been enormous deficits where peace has been equated with different things: the absence of war, negative peace; a working and viable state, as we see in peace building and state building; regional organizations, multilateralism, the donor system, as we saw in liberal peace building; conflict resolution, human needs and equality; conflict transformation, positive peace, and so on. So there's a long history of thinking around these topics, but the broad arc of history, politics, geopolitics seems to keep pushing the debate back to a rather negative version of peace, and indeed something which I'm calling counter-peace in my work now. Counter-peace, in some work I'm doing with Gizim Vazoka from Dublin City University and Sandra Pagoda also from Manchester University, as I understand it, is a bit like counter-revolution. It is the conservative challenge against the scientific advances that are embedded in peace processes, particularly those that are developing in multilateral settings, which draw widely on scientific knowledge, on institutional knowledge, and so on. So what we have developing, I think, over the last 100 years, and of course more, is an international peace architecture. And this reached its height in an understanding of a democratic social contract with a liberal democratic state, embedded in a regional architecture like the African Union or the European Union and others, which itself was governed in a multilateral international setting by international law and by attempts to build consensus and deal with problems that way in the international setting. And most peace processes during that period, if you like, tried to build on basic geopolitical security, tried to redesign a better, more stable state through these precepts, tried to build regional stability by dealing with geopolitics, often by establishing regional diplomatic processes and even institutions, building up a multilateral international system and anchoring all of those peace practices, whether it was peacekeeping or mediation or conflict resolution or transformation, within that framework. And that's the international peace architecture. The international peace architecture, if I dig a little deeper, appears to be a kind of linear development of political theory, followed by several hundred years later, perhaps 300 years later, by some policy making, some institution building, where we arrive at something like the 1945 UN Charter, the Bretton Woods system, or the post-Cold War Washington Consensus, which itself then becomes policy and is implemented much later on. Of course, raising the question we face today with the likes of Afghanistan, what happens when they break down? And of course, that also has knock-on implications for many of the peace processes of the last 50 or so years, you know, from the Cyprus peace process starting back in, I suppose, post-1974, through to the peace process that set up some kind of stable order in the Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo, the failed situations in Syria, and what happens in many other hot conflicts or frozen peace processes now around the world. And I would put those, I'll bracket those dynamics into a counter-peace framework. So what we have roughly here is an international peace architecture which is built up over 100 years and more, based on scientific thinking, developed into policy in a very complex way, which is opposed at the outset by the forces of war and the politics around those forces of war and violence, has been placated to some extent in that long historical view, and now is coming back into full view as a counter-peace dynamic, like a counter-revolutionary dynamic, in which conservative forces around the world reject peace theory and policy in practice, and are pursuing, let's say, fascist goals, the valorization of state power and nationalism over all else, or pursuing social Darwinist goals. Inequality, war and violence are things which we profit from, which humanity profits from, states profit from, and so on. So it's a kind of reversionary characteristic. It's a bit like a Burkean critique of the French Revolution. What's so good about the French Revolution? There's nothing. We don't believe in rights. We believe in aristocracy and monarchy and stability that comes from the ability to harness that type of long-standing power structure. So that's the broad brushstroke. Let me dig a little bit into the development of the international peace architecture, and then I'll say a few words about this counter-peace framework that I'm interested in. And I should say that the development of the international peace architecture is a fairly familiar story. I think I'll be able to pick out a few things to say about it which are fairly original, but the really original, the really interesting and original stuff is to develop the idea that the counter-peace is just as much as a process, a dynamic, a theory, and a practice in world politics, as is the far more well-known, far better recognized conceptual and policy framework of peace building and peacekeeping and mediation and a peace process. So the international peace architecture, I think, really has 6 main stages. It's a historical evolution, and each of these stages has given rise to a particular type of practice in the realm of peace and conflict studies and policy. If we go back to the first stage, it's the very well-known stage of geopolitics, of security balancing between empires and states in Europe in the 19th century, and of developing sophisticated tools of diplomacy to avoid war while achieving your national interest objectives. And that kind of realist bedrock is the bedrock of the modern peace architecture. A second stage takes us into Wilsonian thinking about the need to democratize states and to have self-determination, to understand the world not as a system of competing empires, but of self-determining and autonomous democratic states, reflecting the Kantian argument and the Wilsonian system that emerged briefly at the end of World War I, which represented a collapse of stage 1 of the architecture. So stage 2 develops to stabilize that failed geopolitical stage 1, in which mediation and diplomacy and balancing had been the tools for making peace and themselves had failed. Stage 2 is more grandiose. It's about redesigning the international system, dismantling world empires, replacing them with democracies, and using constitutional law and change and reform, as well as global trade, to deal with conflict. So that's, if you like, that's a world system way of dealing with war, rather than the kind of small-scale diplomatic frameworks and sort of mediation military tools that were used in stage 1. Stage 3 is a different departure. Stage 3 builds on those 2 stages. Stage 1 is kind of stabilized by stage 2, and then stage 2 itself, of course, rapidly collapses in the 1920s and 1930s with the failure of the League of Nations, the outbreak of World War II. And what we have is the rise of two key strands, I think, in stage 3 for dealing with war. One is, of course, Marx and the idea that you had to have economic inequality within the state, but also international inequality, which also connects to the second, which is decolonization. And again, these are two big levers for peacemaking in that middle part of the 20th century, going up to World War II and then coming out of World War II, and much of which is adopted by the time we get to stage 4. And stage 4 is most recognizably known as liberal peace building, which sort of brings all of these things together. You have the security architecture of NATO, which is the geopolitics stuff in stage 1. You have the liberal democratization and free trade arguments of stage 2. You have the attempts to build a decolonized world order of states, which are regionalized with development, which lead to thinking about how one builds states and regional architectures that fits into that liberal democratic framework. So stage 4 was liberal peace building, and it had to stabilize all those previous layers, many of which were very fragile, misunderstood. Now they're sort of receding into the mists of time, and people have forgotten, you know, what did the League of Nations do? Why did it exist? What was the Congress of Vienna? What did the concert do? You know, and so on and so forth. But what I'm sort of arguing here is that these layers are building up historically in the international peace architecture. Every time one looks like it's about to fail, a new one emerges, stabilizes the past one, and begins to propose and develop new methods of peacekeeping and peace building and peacemaking and mediation for dealing with the next layer. And they also reflect new types of conflict that are emerging in world politics. I suppose the big caveat to all of this buildup of the architecture over this period is that new layers always emerge after new types of conflict and war have emerged. So the so-called new wars of the 1990s emerged first, let's say the Balkans, and then we had liberal peace building. So we're always behind the curve with the development of these stages in the international peace architecture. The architecture itself is also misunderstood or badly understood. It's not a structured thing in world politics. It's more of a kind of archaeological and social international development. It's something which isn't planned per se. It's evolving over time. So it has this kind of anthropological quality to it. It is becoming increasingly complex over time, which means it becomes more and more resource hungry, but also more and more misunderstood. So we have this strange situation where the very systems that maintain peace in the short term and the long term are building up and becoming more complex. But as they do so, they are also becoming less viable in both resource terms, in intellectual terms, and in policy terms. And it gets worse. The more the architecture, the international peace architecture has built up, the more it undermines the interests of power holders in the international system. That's social and national elites in the state, elite actors in regional and international politics, dominant actors in the global political economy, and so on. So the more we have this progressive and sort of reformist international architecture building up to deal with war, prevent war, and to replace it with more ambitious forms of politics, then the more opposition it creates. And you can see that in stage 5 of the international peace architecture, which was the state building framework that emerges with Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s. And this was the first layer, I think, in the history of the architecture, which was actually a step backwards. So steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 appeared to become more sophisticated, and each one appeared to approximate more closely the political claims of everyday and social actors involved in peace and reform processes around the world. So we began by level 4 to talk very broadly of human rights, of gender security, of sustainability, of equality between different ethnic identity groups, and so on and so forth. We were able to bring in much broader array of rights-based thinking into how we understood peace. And if you use that to look back at the history of conflict resolution, conflict transformation, and conflict management, you can see that big steps have been made from negative peace to positive peace to hybrid peace to everyday peace. Each of those steps expanding the nature and the term of peace. Stage 5 said, hang on a minute, this is too big. It's undermining the prerogatives and interests of the major power holders in international politics. So what we're going to do is we're going to redesign how we think about peacemaking, and we're going to focus all of our security and diplomatic and trade energy on designing a certain type of state, a state like Iraq after 2004, a state that's open to capital and free trade, which is able to guarantee to a limited extent domestic security as well as regional security. But basically, we're going to drop the rights agenda, the human rights agenda, the equality agenda, the sustainability agenda, and so on. So what we see at that point is we see that in the UN policy, in the multilateral setting, this trajectory of peace as a kind of progressive process, expanding, becoming more complex, new layers being added to it, continues. But amongst the power holders, it goes into reverse. So now we have a contradiction between the flow of international politics in the real world and the theories and policy prescriptions that are being produced in the academic and the policy setting. That's stage 5. By the time we get to stage 6, this is where we are now. It's very ill-formed and hard to say what's happening, but what we can see is there are new and complex forms of violence amongst us now, and we've been seeing this in various forms, where civil wars that can't be ended, that become regional, where the escalations are managed at the geopolitical level, but the civil war continued. Syria, Yemen, frozen conflicts, legacy conflicts from those long-standing 1950s, 1960s, 70s periods, legacy conflicts from liberal peace building in the 1990s, the advent of what we call digital conflicts, those which arise with new technologies, new ways of fighting war, new ways of influencing people, new ways of breaking down the social contract, and so on. So stage 6 suggests that there's a whole new array of risk factors for violence. And what we haven't seen yet at this stage of the development of the international architecture is what its response will be. How do we respond to that? What will be the new layer? So we've had, the balance of power, liberal democracy and self-determination, equality and decolonization, liberal peace building, state building, and stage 6, we don't know what the answer is. And this brings me to counter peace, which is the final part of my talk. And this is something that I've been working on most recently. And I really think this is a big oversight in peace and conflict studies. In many other theoretical discourses and policy discourses, we tend to have a very clear idea about what opposes scientific knowledge, as well as policy practice, and in particular, the connection between scientific knowledge and policy practice. So that would be here, the UN, the multilateral scientific venues, the scholars, and so on, and its connection with policy practices in the design of peace processes. Now, I probably don't need to remind you that we've had Trump's mediation in the Middle East, his attempt to deal with Afghanistan, and various other attempts, many mediations in Syria, North Korea, South Korea, and so on and so forth, as well as, you know, the ongoing problem of terrorism and so on. And none of those practices were connected with theory, with the latest in scientific thinking about peace and conflict studies, which is a sort of peculiar situation, really. And it set me thinking about a new research agenda, which sort of looks at these ways in which practice becomes increasingly divorced from the development and progress of theoretical debate, even though policy doctrines, such as those being produced by the UN Secretariat, seem to be in line with the science. And as this gap grows, we seem to be finding ourselves in more and more trouble, and more of those peace processes are becoming frozen and collapse. So I started thinking about blockages in peace processes. You know, some of the blockages that we've been observing over the last 30 or 40 years are very obvious. Sovereignty and contending claims to sovereignty has been one big one. Think about Cyprus, for example. The drawing of boundaries, another huge problem. If you think about conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa region, as well as in the Balkans, boundaries are huge issues. Identity, ethnicity, religion, language, the ways in which they are used to draw majority and minority groups, often promote conflict. Inequality is a huge one. So, you know, you could say that all of these, if they are not addressed by theoretical tools, are blockages to peace processes. I mean, it's very clear, to take one that's close to you, that's the Cyprus case, that the inability to deal with conflicting identities, with the distribution of powers, with multiple claims to sovereignty over the same bits of territory, and so on, has turned the peace process in Cyprus into more of a holding activity. You know, you can prevent violence and have a negative peace by having a continual peace process. And to do that, you turn the peace process into a kind of theatre where you keep having talks and debates and diplomatic engagement and so on and so forth. But actually the goal is to avoid a peace settlement, because the settlement would bring about a set of concessions which would be incompatible with the parties' objectives. So a kind of secondary or even a primary objective is to have a peace without a peace settlement. And to do that, you have to maintain the peace process. To maintain the peace process, you have inconclusive talks and lengthy buffer methods of spacing those talks. So elections, consultations, and so on and so forth. So this is the beginnings of counter-peace. I just want to leave you with some thoughts about the counter-peace now. So if we have failed to understand that the exploitation of peace processes, peace building and state building, conflict resolution, transformation, and so on, is just as much of a process, a dynamic made up of a series, a manipulated series of blockages by actors that avoid peace processes or reject peace processes with outcomes, but quite like the process, or outright spoilers, then we're really missing a lot of the debate about why peace processes are so problematic and difficult in the international system. So what I'm proposing that we do here is that we start to think about counter-peace dynamics themselves as informally or formally orchestrated processes, which kind of mirror and shadow a peace process or peace building, taking resources away from it, blocking it, yet keeping it alive, and that this itself has become a new type of practice in international relations, something kind of in the grey areas between peace and war. And my sort of final proposition here is that in most of those peace processes, from Cyprus through to Bosnia and Kosovo, even Iraq and Afghanistan, there is a specific pattern that we can look out for, which denotes that we've moved from a peace process to a counter-peace process. Just like when we look at a revolution, like the French Revolution, we can see that there are specific dynamics and phenomena which emerge when the revolution starts to eat itself. We move into a counter-revolution, which leads to the restoration, in France's case, of the monarchy and the aristocracy, the very thing the revolution was supposed to overthrow. So in this case, if a peace process becomes very extended, then clearly something is happening, isn't it? Clearly the peace process is beginning to exist, not because it gains settlement, but because it's a process with resources and dynamics. If there is no movement and regression in the parties' positions, if civil society is excluded or brought in but not listened to, if regional players move away from the talks, there's a whole series of very obvious dynamics which we can look at different peace processes and start to see that they perhaps are no longer a peace process as we understand it. And actually they're more fully devoted to countering that process. The broadest pattern that I can think of as a starting point for work in this, and this is going to become a book eventually, is to say that if you recognize that what you have now ongoing in a peace process, peace building situation, state building, and so on, reflects this pattern: a weak civil society, strong elites with little accountability, whether they control the state or institutions of the state, and a weak or disinterested or withdrawing international community, then you can say that this process has turned into a counter-peace. And the counter-peace then becomes aimed at rejecting scientific advancement in the peace process. So pushing out the UN, the multilaterals, the agencies, the donors, the academics and the scholars, and becomes more fully focused on geopolitical or neo-geopolitical interests in a digital world, if you like. So the peace process then just becomes part of old-fashioned politics, if you like. But because there are still advantages in being part of the peace process, access to the international community, development aid, military support, legitimacy, credibility, and so on and so forth, those become the objectives of the peace process. So weak civil society, strong state or elites, weak international involvement. It's a pattern which suggests that we're talking about a very negative form of peace or geopolitics, and that, if you like, the idea of a peace process has simply become a cover for something which is far more dangerous and risky, and which probably won't lead to a negotiated and consensual settlement, which will be in line with the international peace architecture and its epistemic development over time. Okay, so that's sort of the hypothesis, and what I'm doing now in this project is looking at the ways in which critical thinking helps us understand the pros and cons of the development of the international peace architecture, which is a very muddy and confused thing. It pits communism and socialism with decolonization and geopolitics and Western Eurocentrism, and tries to stabilize all of these contradictory forces in the broader context of global change and scarce resources and all the things we know about politics. And the counterpiece does a different trick, which is it says that we don't need a lot of the peace architecture. So what we need to do is pare it down to some very basic resources: security, power. That's it. And these are two sort of very divergent philosophies in the history of world politics. One is that you need progress and equality and sustainability. kind of, almost a Rousseauian sort of derived progress. And the other is that actually what you need is competition and violence and war to bring out the best in human development to overcome these sorts of challenges. And I think this is a really serious proposition, because in the last 100 years or so, we've come to assume that the liberal progressive mode of thinking about peace processes is at the center of the universe, is very Eurocentric. And what we've actually done is we have excluded groups bit by bit who were also involved in the design of this system, even if only by rejecting it or being negative about it. So the architecture itself in the long term has been destabilized by that. As it becomes more complex, more expensive, more difficult to understand, intergenerational, the forces of the counterpiece are find it more easy to refute it, topple it, and replace it. The problem is that the counterpiece framework doesn't really have any ideas. Both of these architectures, if you like, are entangled with each other. The peace architecture is sort of entangled with the counterpiece. The counterpiece needs the peace architecture to survive, and yet it doesn't want it. The peace architecture wants to eradicate the counterpiece dynamics, and yet we know you have to have consent and consensus and participation and a broad sweep of engagement in a long-standing, sustainable, viable peace process. So there's some kind of existential questions there for us to think about in peacemaking, which I think we're also confronting today in Afghanistan and perhaps in Syria and many other places now around the world, about what happens to all of those peace processes that emerged from the progressive peace architecture, which are now being taken over by the counterpiece. Where will that lead us to? So rather pessimistic notes to end on, but I think we need to start thinking about the reasons why peace processes and peace building haven't worked. Look at those reasons, not just in the sense of ad hoc and scattered problems or inefficiencies in theory building and policy implementation, but as a completely separate but entangled system themselves. So we can start talking about counter peacekeeping, counter mediation, counter peace processes, counter peace building, in order to have a more realistic understanding of the actual politics that are going on in every peace process. And I think I should stop there.
Thank you, Professor Richmond. Thank you for that great speech. If you allow me, we can carry on with the Q&A session right now, following that great speech. Dear participants, if you have any questions for Professor Richmond, please raise your hand. Then please introduce yourself shortly and ask your questions. And also, please bear in mind to keep your questions short as well. And if you want, you can send us text messages through the chat box over there. I don't want to spoil my position right now, but I want to ask that a question first. I found quite interesting one of the concepts you produced with one of your colleagues, Eastphalian peace. I read that article, and for me it was a new concept, that Eastphalian peace, and I'm interested that, do you believe that it is the perfection of the Westphalian peace? Do you believe that Eastphalian peace would replace the Westphalian peace in the future, or right now? I don't know.
So that was an article that I wrote with a Japanese colleague of mine, called Yuji Yasuji, who is based in Tokyo, and he's working with a research group there on hybrid forms of peace. And they've been doing a lot in Timor and Southeast Asia, Cambodia. And they also turned to thinking about more sort of indigenous Japanese, and also doing some work on Chinese thinking about peace. And I think these debates are now becoming well, they're coming now more and more to our attention, because we've sort of missed them in the West, because we're so Eurocentric and focused on the American design of conflict resolution and transformation and peace building and so on. And of course, as world politics is shifting, pivoting, I think conceptual development is also pivoting. So that article was not supposed to suggest that Eastphalian peace is going to replace Westphalian peace, but it was supposed to suggest that there is an increasingly obvious dialogue occurring conceptually and theoretically, with some similar and also some different propositions. And I should also point out that, you know, Western thinking about peace praxis really failed in the 20th century, failed to come to terms with inputs from the global South. So it talks about decolonization in a way that suggested it was really about shifting responsibility for statecraft and politics to former colonial peoples in sub-Saharan Africa and so on and so forth. It didn't talk about it explicitly as a mode of peacemaking in the international system too. And I think that was really problematic, because many of the global South leaders of the day, I mean, Ali Masri and so many others, did see it explicitly as a way of building a regional peace and a global peace. And they were making proposals which the West just completely ignored. Resource transfer, technology transfer, regional federations, self-determination, brotherhood of man. You know, these were kind of big ideas that were problematic particularly for American foreign policymakers, British foreign policymakers, and many in the West who were fighting their Cold War and so on, and really sort of believed that the design of the international system and related tools for peacemaking, because every political system needs tools for peacemaking, was their responsibility. So that piece was really an attempt to kind of put the Westphalian and the Eastphalian concepts on the same platform, and to look at the differences and similarities, but not to sort of judge them and say one's better than the other. I mean, I think we can safely say that the Westphalian piece has had its catastrophes, and you know, the Eastphalian peace framework also draws on some of the same dynamics that have led to those catastrophes as well. You know, I mean, the reliance on the states, the black and white understanding of non-intervention, in which, you know, non-intervention is the key principle. Intervention doesn't happen. If you don't have intervention, how can you do peacemaking? How can you rescue oppressed groups? How can you engage with subaltern political claims? So we can't ask any of those questions, even if we don't agree with the answers, under that kind of closed sovereign system. So it still aspires to the same ontological assumptions that are associated with sovereignty, and it then sets you off on the same journey. How do you build a social contract with the states? Where are checks and balances? What does the state do in its foreign policy? How does the state separate foreign policy from domestic policy? How does it connect with territory? How does it deal with minorities? You know, and so on. The rationality is pretty much the same. So it's not really a normative evaluation. It's just suggesting that there are, you know, big conceptual frameworks we can also look at that we've ignored.
Thank you, Professor Richmond. You know, today, Joe Biden, the President of the United States of America, you know, he tweeted about the Afghanistan's withdrawal. You know, he mentioned that the decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. Now, that remake other countries, the ending of the remake other countries, is that related to that Eastphalian or Westphalian dichotomy?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's sort of, again, is indicative of how uncertain, how much policy making swings in the kind of longer term between different ideological positions. when scientific evidence is sort of chugging along on its own path. You know, when the war on terror began and we had this sort of this emergence of revenge state building and all this kind of stuff which emerged in Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of academics opposed the interventions, as well as opposing the ways in which domestic counterterrorism campaigns were being carried out, and pointed out that this wouldn't build consensus and consent, and it didn't do many of the things that peace and conflict theory said it should do. It didn't address human needs, it created insecurity, it would lead to future regional instability, it would create more security dilemmas. And so, you know, what we have is a sort of a policy hegemon, that's the United States, which is swinging between two ideological poles, isolationism, interventionism, and seems to me to be separated from the development of theory. And I think those wild swings in the way in which they are implementing elements of the international peace architecture in practice are kind of part of the counter-peace framework, because there's an instability in the ways in which we are engaging with wars and conflicts around the world. We're basically using it in a political sense to retard those peace processes, hold back rights, block Spalting claims, prevent sustainability. So it becomes a kind of counter-peace process, doesn't it? So I think here we have a problem. I mean, the science didn't agree with the invasions in the first place, and now the science also is pointing out that if you withdraw, the gains will be lost. It's fairly clear. And I think if you look at historical evidence, you'll see that it'll be fairly rapid. So what's happened here is that the political elites, who are in the end responsible for peace and development, intervention, and so on, are not able to understand the architecture. It's just too complex. It's long-term, it's long-range, it's not in their experience. And therefore they take sort of short-termist positions, which again, as I started out in the beginning of my talk, connect very closely to their own domestic politics, their attempts to have domestic majorities, for example, Biden's midterms, not to the science, and certainly not to the conditions of domestic populations. Now, in international peace architecture terms, as far as I can see with the development of these stages, that type of situation suggests that one stage has collapsed or is collapsing, so that would be stage 5, state building. And unfortunately, what we don't have is a stage 6 to stabilize the outcome. So this whole architecture, you know, it's built up over time, it's got bigger and bigger, heavier and heavier. The counterpiece is becoming more and more predominant as it develops. And as we've seen in those 5 stages, something has always arisen just in time to stabilize the last layer before it reaches the point of collapse. This time that hasn't happened. So we're at stage 5, the collapse of state building, as Biden has said, nation building, with nothing to replace it, apart from drone attacks, hardened national boundaries, measures against migration. And basically much of that, you know, in epistemological terms, means not engaging with global politics, not being able to engage with sustainability because sustainability is a global problem, ignoring the human rights of others, and basically rebuilding a hierarchical international system rather than the multilaterally flattened system as was briefly emerging perhaps in the 1990s. All of those seem to me to be very retrogressive, and they all seem to me to be risking the collapse of the entire architecture itself. I should say, as a caveat here, that I came up with this idea of an international peace architecture by looking at some archaeological work. And some archaeological theory has been proposing, by looking at the archaeological records of lost civilizations, that they see the same pattern. Over time, the civilizations build up different layers of political responses to their problems. Over a long term, the system becomes too complex and too expensive to maintain, people withdraw their consent, they forget why it's there anyway, and then the whole civilization collapses. And you have these sudden collapses of civilizations. And I think we've seen this in the architecture, the international peace architecture. But for the first time in human history, we are also able to recognize that. So we better do something about it. We need a stage 6, and it needs to be good, because it needs to stabilize the existing 5 layers and deal with the new pressures in the international system, which I think are enhanced claims for global justice from subaltern communities around the world who've suffered violence under the global political economy, from the colonial system, and from the state system in the last 300 years. So what we need is a peace process that just doesn't deal with local human rights or local democratic rights or some local development. It moves on to a global system, much like the 1945 UN Charter tried to do. We need a replication of something like that in order to overcome these blockages and turn the architecture from eating itself in a counterpeace dynamic to being a more positive force in contemporary history, and being a platform for better forms of mediation, more sophisticated forms of peace building and development, and so on.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question from Ido Johnson. Sorry for my pronunciation. Ido Johnson, yeah. He's asking that to what extent can counter-peace process address the issue of conflicts in multi-ethnic societies?
Counter-peace processes don't address the issues as we would understand them in peace and conflict studies. They exploit the issues. So a counter-peace process would probably attempt a majoritarian solution supported by a regional hegemon under geopolitics and neoliberalism. Now, you know, maybe if you're a policymaker or a politician and your engagement with the development of theory and science is limited, you might think that's a short-term viable process which will keep you in power for the next 2 or 3 years until the next election. But from a scientific point of view, it is a short-term solution which will harm people. It will be counter to international law, human rights law, and it will run the risk of escalating further conflicts in the region, possibly around the world. So we're simply just repeating the same old story over and over again. I mean, why are we allowing the counterpiece to have the upper hand when we know that it really just leads to cycles of conflict? They can be managed in the short term, but probably not in the long term. Now, it's also not acceptable for us to have these long-standing frozen, stalemated peace processes, like in Cyprus, mediation for 50 years, led nowhere. Now everyone's discussing informally or formally the two-state solution, when the premise of the whole international engagement was a multilateral, pluralist framework of federalism of some form or other. So we have this sort of odd situation where practice and the science in a kind of post-truth world is being overtaken by anti-scientific, populist outcomes and proposals and settlements, all of which have been used in the past and failed catastrophically because they were sparks that led to escalations somewhere else. I mean, that's tragic, really, isn't it? It's the tragedy of peace and conflict studies and so on, that we keep seeing this pattern over and over again.
Thank you, Professor. In fact, our time is up. You know, it's almost 1 hour, so we cannot take any questions. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Richmond, once again for your time, and hope to meet you in Trabzon soon. I
would love to, yeah. And thank you, and good luck for the rest of your conference.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.